Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I'm happy to welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program tonight. We welcome tonight's guest, Greg Bluestein, and tonight's moderator, Larry Mantle, and thank them both for joining us. We also appreciate them being able and having all the skills to broaden tonight's topic in light of the critical events that are occurring in Washington, D.C. this week. Next week, on October 11th, speaking of DC, we welcome Speaker Emerita of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who will be in conversation with Pat Morrison. We're sure that will be an interesting, informative, and compelling conversation. And then the following week, on October 18th, we welcome Adam Nagurney of the New York Times in conversation also with Pat Morrison. Adam Nagurney covered the 2020 presidential race for the New York Times and is the author of The Times, How the Newspaper of Record Survived Scandal, Scorn, and the Transformation of Judaism, of journalism. The book is hot off the presses. It's just hitting the bookstores this week. The program titled The New York Times and the Transformation of Journalism into the Digital Age. I have big news that will make everybody here happy, so please listen up. A lot of you have had a lot of problems registering with Eventbrite, and as of for our November 1st program, we are switching to a new registration system. It's going to be much easier. You will get the Zoom link directly and can connect to the Zoom from your registration. So tonight, after the program, you will get the emails, the registration links to all of the upcoming programs, including the November 1st one. All you need to do is click on the registration link next to the program that you want to register for, and you will notice when you register for the November 1st program that it's a much easier system, and we are hoping that it solves all of the Eventbrite registration problems that we've had over the last many, many months. So we're excited to be able to make that improvement. And we welcome your positive feedback as well as your negative if you have problems with it, of course. Now for a few more program highlights, my colleague, David Laird. David?
Thanks, Janice. Welcome to America at a Crossroads. Along with the rest of the country, our heads are still spinning from yesterday's events. The drama in a courtroom in New York City and the unprecedented spectacle that took place in the House of Representatives. We are fortunate to have two expert analysts and news mavens with us tonight. Both Greg Bluestein and Larry Mantle are people you want to hear from when troubling events swirl around us. Following the evenings that Janice just mentioned, we'll again host one of our most popular guests, Neil Katyal, the former Solicitor General of the United States. Neil has argued 50 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, and he can put the legal issues that dominate so much of today's news into context. He'll be chatting with tonight's host, LA's Larry Mantle, and that'll be on Thursday, not our usual evening, a Thursday, October 26th. The following Wednesday, our normal night, we host another return newsmaker, David Leonhardt of the New York Times. He has a book coming out, Ours Was the Shining Future, the Story of the American Dream. It'll be out in 3 weeks, and he'll be with us to discuss it while it's still sizzling hot off the press. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner who's written for the Times since 1999. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of our most frequent moderators, Larry Mantle, the host of Air Talk, NPR station, LA's flagship program since 1985. He and the program are the recipients of countless awards, including Journalist of the Year and the Associated Press's coveted Mark Twain Award. And without further ado, Larry, it's all yours.
David, thank you so much. Janice, Mel, and Zev, it's always a pleasure to be with you. No place I'd rather be for a Wednesday night with the remarkable speakers who assemble each and every week for America at a Crossroads. This is a real treat for me. Well, as we all know, the House of Representatives saw that historic day David was mentioning yesterday, the vote to remove California Congressman Kevin McCarthy from the speakership. Appears there are at least two active campaigners for the position, House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan and Louisiana's Steve Scalise. What led up to the ousting of McCarthy was Saturday's passage of a stopgap funding bill to avoid a partial shutdown of the federal government. That led McCarthy's nemesis, Matt Gaetz, of Florida to single-handedly set in motion the votes which brought down McCarthy. Now the question over the next week, who will succeed the former speaker? And with us to talk national politics as well as his specialty, Georgia's dynamic political scene, is Atlanta Journal-Constitution politics reporter Greg Bluestein. He not only writes for the front page of the paper, he co-hosts the Politically Georgia podcast, makes frequent appearances on MSNBC and NBC News, and he's the author of Flipped, a book about Georgia's epic 2020 election. Greg, it's so good to have you with us this evening for America at Crossroads.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It's such an honor.
Before we get to national politics, do you have to pinch yourself that here you are, born and raised in Georgia, University of Georgia graduate, and you happen to be the leading politics reporter in the state that is the pivotal state politically in the U.S.?
I heard one of the guests was from Dunwoody, Georgia. I live in Dunwoody, grew up right around the corner from here, and always wanted to be, well, since I was in fourth grade, and the great I.J. Rosenberg, the Braves beat writer for the AJC, came to the Greenfield Hebrew Academy, which was where I went to fourth grade, and spoke to our class. I've wanted to be a reporter since way back then. And, I did not expect there, not so long ago, I was maybe one of a handful of reporters trailing Governor Deal as he was running for re-election in 2014. And then suddenly now there's, sprouting TV cameras everywhere Governor Brian Kemp or any other Georgia politician goes.
Yeah, it's got to be just a whirlwind. Well, let's talk about what's happening on Capitol Hill, where we have Patrick McHenry of North Carolina as the interim Speaker of the House, but that's just a matter of days. First of all, what, if anything, surprised you most about the way the ouster of McCarthy unfolded?
I was frankly surprised more of the far right Republicans didn't break ranks with the rank and file and vote against McCarthy. I just thought the dam would kind of be broken once you had that critical number. I think it was ended up at 8. Here in Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Andrew Clyde, Mike Collins, those were 3 far right Republicans. Everyone's heard of Marjorie Taylor Greene. The other 2 are probably equally, they're not as maybe provocative as she is sometimes, but they are equally conservative and they have similar voting records. But all 3 of them held with the vote against the vacate of the speaker's gavel. But of course, all it takes is a handful of votes, and those 8 or so that voted against him did him in. There's been a lot of debate here in Georgia. I know there's a lot of national debate about whether Democrats made the right move by opposing or by voting to vacate Speaker McCarthy. It's hard. I mean, I've talked to several members of our congressional delegation here in the last few hours. They all kind of said the same thing. Why would we vote to keep him in office after what he's done to Democratic causes and to the priorities of the Democratic Party, whether it be calling them socialist, Marxist, whether it be launching impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden, that even Republican rank and file lawmakers said was garbage, or whether it be siding with the MAGA side of the Republican Party and breaking promises. So no, it's
the
right move, but that's where we are.
But those Democrats couldn't realistically have also thought that there wouldn't be an impeachment investigation of Biden launched if it was another House Speaker, because the pressure was there among Republicans to do that, that there wouldn't be kowtowing to former President Trump, given the sway that he holds in the party. So if that was really what offended them about McCarthy, it's not going to be anything different on those counts.
It won't. And frankly, even if they had voted to keep him in office, the fact that he needed Democratic support, even if he didn't make those direct overtures himself. I know that was the narrative out of his office, that his allies were asking Democrats for support, not McCarthy himself. But if it even had one Democratic vote that helped put him over the top, he'd be facing this conundrum in a few more days, right? There was a great lead of the Washington Post analysis that basically said that Kevin McCarthy was blaming Democrats for not putting out the fire that he started himself. I thought that was a great way to put it. And we'd be right back in the same scenario, I think, had Democrats voted to keep him in that leadership post. And look, we might have a new speaker later on this week, and we might be in the same situation next week at this point anyway. I mean, that's how paralyzed is a good word for it. Chaotic is a better word for it. Disastrous is a word for it. That's how desperate this situation right now is.
Greg, how do you figure when McCarthy in his news conference said, well, first thing you got to change the rules because no speaker can operate where you have an individual like Matt Gaetz who comes forward and puts the speaker's job into play like that, and where you can have the minority party in a closely split house, ousting the House Speaker. It seemed odd when he was the one who capitulated to the pressure to get the office to make that rules change.
Exactly. He's kind of trying to rewrite the narrative, rewrite history. Now, he's the one who agreed to that unprecedented, I think it's unprecedented, it's certainly in the modern era unprecedented motion that basically lets just one member of his caucus call a motion to vacate. And this was a threat, sort of a sword hanging over his speakership the entire time, ever since he got the gavel. We knew this could happen. We weren't sure who would bring it, but we were pretty sure it could be Matt Gaetz. That was at least one of the going theories, and here we are.
I wanted to ask about Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, of course, is your highly controversial Congress member from Georgia, district northwest of Atlanta. And she didn't vote to oust McCarthy. He was very supportive of her when she got kicked out of the Freedom Caucus. So, what's the nature of her role in the whole speakership?
Yeah, Speaker McCarthy boasted to friends that they had this ironclad relationship. She was a pariah, obviously, just a couple of years ago. I first met Marjorie Taylor Greene, believe it or not, in an Israeli-owned coffee shop right around the corner from me in Dunwoody when she was running for Congress in suburban Atlanta, not in the seat that she holds now, but in suburban Atlanta against incumbent Republican Congresswoman Karen Handel. And I had never heard of her. No one on the national scene had really ever heard of her. Certainly in Republican circles, even here in Georgia, she was an unknown quantity at that point. Obviously, she built a campaign up on provocative, controversial, far-right messaging, her QAnon history, her history of bizarre, racist, xenophobic statements were quickly surfaced. And it didn't matter because when the seat opened in Northwest Georgia, there was a number of candidates. I think it was 6 or 7 Republican candidates got in, including a neurosurgeon who had deep roots in the community. And Marjorie Taylor Greene moved her already up and running campaign from Metro Atlanta up there, quickly was sanctioned after I wrote a story when she won saying she'd be a bigger nightmare for Republicans than even Democrats, because already you could tell that Brian Kemp, that other powerful Republicans here in Georgia were having nightmares over her. She was demoted, right? She lost her committee assignments. She was a pariah. No one wanted to be around her until Kevin McCarthy sort of resuscitated her career, just like he's been, blamed or accused of resuscitating Donald Trump's career after January 6th. When he turned to her for crucial support during his battle for the speaker's gavel, that gave her much more clout, put her on very important committees, including the Oversight Committee. And now at least until a couple hours ago, she was a power player. We said in our morning newsletter at the AJC that she's the biggest loser, at least in Georgia, of all that went down, because without her big protector, Kevin McCarthy, we're not sure what happens. We know she'll still be provocative. She'll still have lots of Twitter followers and raise lots and lots of money. She's still in a very safe district. Her opponent spent more than $17 million trying to beat her and didn't even come within 35 points.
It's just because her profile is so huge. And clearly there's something about her extreme message that's connecting with that district.
It is. Her profile is huge. There's certainly moderate Republicans in Northwest Georgia. I was up there just a couple of days ago to interview a number of voters and local leaders. And there's certainly plenty who are tired of her antics, will never vote for her. But look, it's gerrymandering. It's a district that was drawn overwhelmingly to be Republican. And so it's a race to the right. And, let me put it this way. In 2020, the Democrat who ended up winning the nomination had to drop out of the race. He was bullied and harassed. He says that's not the reason he was dropped out of the race, but he was worried for his life. There was death threats. There was all sorts of things. He ended up moving back to his mom's house in Ohio before the election even happened. Democrats kind of wrote that district off, and there's good reason, because this past election cycle, a Democrat who did have a real campaign, as I mentioned earlier, raised an epic amount of money. I mean, $17 million is more than statewide candidates in most states not named California raise, Georgia, other than the governor's race. That's by far, I mean, that's a statewide campaign money. And yet he didn't even make a dent in her armor. So it's gerrymandered, and she's got that name recognition.
I want to come back to the gerrymandering, the lawsuits that are in place against how the GOP drew the most recent districts and where that stands in court. But I just want to remind viewers, because we're speaking very broadly tonight, we'll probably bounce back and forth between national issues and Georgia politics, Georgia being so pivotal to our national elections as well. So please share with us any questions that you have about any of the wide range of topics we're going to touch on in this hour. You can do it in the Q&A. Please include your location if you don't mind, because it's just nice to say your first name and where you're from to give a sense of place along with a question. But please ask the questions, because we have an awful lot that we can possibly cover, and we want to tailor it as much to what your interests are on this. So Greg, before we'll get back to the issue of the gerrymandering, I do want to come back though to the battle in the House. And what we see is the total disarray among Republicans and their slim majority. So what comes next? And is it all dependent on who is the speaker, or are the factors that are going to be in conflict going to be the same regardless of who holds that position?
I don't think the factors change at all. It's still, you're talking a handful of Republican votes, just one motion. Well, if the rules stay the same, just one vote, one motion, one supporter of a motion to vacate can call the gavel to question, unless the rules change under a new speaker, which I know there's been some legal questions about whether or not that can happen. The battles are also, look, Steve Scalise, Jim Jordan, those are the two main contenders for the speaker's gavel. There's a number of other battles down for other leadership posts, but both of them are kind of dyed-in-the-wool hardline conservatives. Jim Jordan, I think, is more closely, it's safe to say he's more closely allied with the former president, but Steve Scalise is no moderate, right? And so either way, you're going to have a very conservative speakership. Steve Scalise came close, right? He's someone who has harbored ambitions to have the speaker's gavel before. Jim Jordan, on the other hand, was very much more skeptical of that idea in recent years. And so this is a situation where he's saying he's being talked into it. He's someone that sort of the hardline Republican faction sees as a deal breaker. If he's not in that gavel, it doesn't have that speaker's gavel. But what we're really looking at in the next few hours, really in days, is an all-out brawl within the Republican caucus. There's closed-door meetings, but many of this is surfacing in public, on cable news, in quotes to reporters like me about just where things are lining up. And and policy-wise, you're not going to see too much of a difference, but style and approach, you're going to see a drastic difference.
Well, and what is this going to mean for the potential partial shutdown of the government? Because, of course, the bill that they passed over the weekend is only short term.
Yeah, we're talking at this point about 40 days, right? President Biden spoke to the American public earlier today and begged Republicans to eliminate this poisonous, in his words, atmosphere in the House. Look, there will be pressure on Democrats to pick a favorite too. But again, especially the Republican hardliners, they're not going to want to see anyone who gets over the finish line with Democratic support. At the same time, if you look at the priorities for many Democrats and at least a big consequential block of Republicans, they remain the same: Ukrainian funding and keeping the government open, because Republicans will get blamed if this goes into a shutdown. And history tells you that the voters don't like very much, especially when they feel the pain of a shutdown. They'll exact some revenge on that party they blame.
And with Ukrainian funding, is that going to be at least in part dependent on who the speaker is?
Yeah, exactly. If it's a speaker who is resolute against any sort of compromise on Ukrainian funding, and again, in the Senate, Republicans are trying to figure out a way to hash out some sort of compromise deal. So there's an appetite for this across the way. And remember, the Senate has to approve anything that happens. And we already saw the Senate kind of deal with a bill that got shoved down their throats by the House. But this time, I don't think they're going to be just as willing, especially with 40 or so days left until that deadline. And this is to say it's a top priority of many Democrats is an understatement. We even saw a Democratic vote against that stopgap budget because it didn't include enough military aid for Ukraine. So look, polls show that a general electorate is supportive of it, but a Republican electorate in many of these polls, including here in Georgia, is not. And it's also a messaging issue for the president, for the White House administration, and for Democrats and Republicans who are supportive of it to get to the American people and say why degrading Russia's military, why helping Ukraine fight off the Russian invasion is an American priority.
Well, and it's funny because on this program, we've had so many guests on America to Crossroads have made the point of how funding Ukraine's effort against Russia serves American interests and in a very direct, not even indirect way. And as you say, we have not had, I don't think, the same level of messaging from people who support the funding to Ukraine or even increases in it that has been consistent and out there, certainly in the way that we've heard on these programs. So why is that? It doesn't seem to be, for Democrats, a politically fraught area.
No, I mean, there are some Democratic members of the more liberal wing who are against it, right? But for the most part, most rank and file Democrats are supportive of more of a robust military funding, of military aid for Ukraine. And same with most rank and file Republican elected leaders. Even here in Georgia, I asked Governor Kemp, who's a hard, he used to be seen as a hardline conservative. Now, of course, he's seen more mainstream. He said, I'm for whatever it takes to help Ukraine win this fight against Russia. And of course, it's a national strategic imperative beyond just the threat that Russia has for its European neighbors and the US allies, but also the emerging global threat with the alliance between Russia, Iran, and China is, of course, a top national security priority for the US. And I think part of it is, but going back to your initial questions, it falls to the White House. It falls to President Biden. I know he has a major address where he's going to try to bolster U.S. support and explain to the American public why this should be a priority. But when you have Republican lawmakers and Republican officials who oppose Ukraine funding, talking about inflation and the rising price of gas or household products or you name it, and saying to Americans, hey, you're feeling the pinch of the wallet. Meanwhile, we're giving billions to a foreign army stave off an invasion from Russia. It becomes a pocketbook issue. So Democrats and Republican supporters, because it is a broad bipartisan issue, have to kind of have a more robust message.
Greg, I want to talk also about the effort to hold out and shut down the government from the wing of Republicans in the House who didn't want there to be a bill, and certainly not under the terms that McCarthy agreed to. And I'm trying to get my head around what the end game is there, because we understand that they want to see the federal government significantly cut. They want to see federal spending significantly cut. Nonetheless, they've supported presidents, including former President Trump, who've been very big spenders, who've been anything but really cutters of the federal government. And you also have a slim but a majority of Democrats in the Senate and a Democratic president. So what is the end game for those who are looking to use the shutdown as leverage to get cuts?
That's a great question, Larry, because we haven't heard much of an end game, right? When we've asked these lawmakers who are voting against the budget, including here in Georgia, what is the end game beyond just slashing funding and slashing Ukrainian funding, right? We don't hear that long-term plan. We don't hear anything that can pass muster in the Democratic-controlled Senate, even if it's slim, it's still Democratic-controlled, thanks to Georgia, and the White House, right? And so we still haven't heard those answers, and we hear Republican frustration among I guess you call them more mainstream Republicans, saying exactly that. What's the end game here? What we saw over the past couple of weeks leading up to this stopgap funding compromise where hardline, ultra-conservative Republicans make a series of increasing demands. We won't vote for this until there's an impeachment inquiry. Okay, now there's an impeachment inquiry. We won't vote for this until you zero out this funding, until you do take this step. And every turn of the way, at least we saw that Speaker McCarthy was willing to make those amends, even at the consternation of his more rank and file members of his caucus. And yet here we are, right? And remember, of course, and I know your viewers know this, to many in the hardline Republican Party, any talk of compromise, any talk of working with Democrats is a bad word. And so the moment that Speaker McCarthy, then former Speaker McCarthy, needed Democratic support to pass this bill, we knew his head was on the shopping block, right? We knew that was it.
Again, it seems a logical disconnect because it's impossible for a single party to do something unless you control by significant margins both houses and the White House. And that's not the case for Republicans.
Exactly. And it all goes back to last year's midterm when Republicans, including House leaders, anticipated this red wave that never really materialized, right? They captured enough to have a slim majority in the House, but it's not the 20 seat, 25 seat, even 30 seat majority that some pundits had initially projected. And if we had that, we wouldn't be here today talking about a speaker being asked. I don't know if it would have been Kevin McCarthy, it probably would have, but we certainly wouldn't be in this situation right now, I think, where we'd be talking about this small number of Republican defectors basically instigating a revolt against House leadership.
Before we get into the gerrymandering and legal issues in Georgia, let's take a couple quick viewer questions. Jonathan asked, you mentioned the Democratic candidate Marjorie Taylor Greene's district who'd had threats and actually moved back to Ohio. Have you experienced threats in doing the coverage you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think any reporter kind of on the, I guess you'd say on the front lines of a battleground state has gotten threats. There was an incident last year, and I can talk about it frankly, actually now, because it's been passed, where Herschel Walker's campaign was spreading and knowingly spreading lies about me in fundraising appeals and things like that. And I called one of his officials who was not involved. He was a high-ranking official with Herschel Walker's campaign, but he was not directly involved in this lie. And I said, this is a lie. I don't even want to repeat it, but I said, this is a lie. You know it's a lie because you were with me when this thing happened. Why are you letting this happen? This is the sort of thing that gets me, puts me in a really horrible position because some crazy, supporter could do something really bad. And he apologized. He told me that they're going to retract it, and they never did. This is a party where, at least there's segments of the Republican Party where there is no apologies. There's never backing down. It's seen as a sign of weakness to say, okay, we made a mistake, or, hey, you caught us in a lie. We're going to take it back. And even when it was sort of in a man-to-man situation where I was telling this guy, like, that this thing that you put in your fundraising appeal is a lie, and yet you're still condoning the campaign, put it out there, and you're not taking it back.
Well, and the challenge for you as a journalist, unlike if you're the opposing candidate, they often do file lawsuits against what they say are baldly false claims. In your case, as a journalist covering all of this, you of course could, but it would put you in a terrible position.
Yeah, you know the saying, right? Our listeners know the saying, journalists don't want to be the story.
Yeah.
We don't, and there's always being at the foremost newspaper, the foremost news outlet in Georgia, there's always some ribbing, and there's just yesterday was the governor's mansion, and he was announcing an award from a publication called Area Develop Magazine that if you're not an economic developer, you've never heard of. And every time they win this award, I call it a niche magazine, which it is. And the governor said, over the last 10 years, since Georgia first got this award, Georgia has attracted 350,000 new jobs. That's more subscriber than the niche newspaper, the AJC has, right? So there's a little of that.
Touche.
And it's I don't know if it's good natured. It's certainly not, but he enjoyed it. And I'm not going to go storm out in a huff, right? Because you don't want to be.
But that's different than an absolute false claim about.
Exactly. That's different than false claim, and it's certainly not a threat. But then there's others who, Donald Trump was on stage in Georgia a year ago, and a candidate went up on the stage and called me out. He has 1 minute on stage with Donald Trump, and he's there to blast Greg. I forgot what he called me, Loserstein or something. Whatever it was not something I've heard since I was I don't think I had even heard it in kindergarten at Temple Manuel. So, I haven't heard it in a very long time, if ever. And, you always are concerned about that. You take your proper precautions. I let my editors know if I really feel like there's a concern, a security risk, and I have at different points. But my wife is very, nervous about me putting certain things on social media, so I listen to her. But I think that's just, unfortunately, it comes with the territory
These
especially on the
days,
front lines.
sadly. Yeah. Howard asks, will there be any ramifications from the acting speaker expelling Speaker Pelosi, who's the guest next week, by the way, with Pat Morrison, from her office in the Capitol? I had not heard about this, so this is just a viewer. Perhaps you can elaborate, Greg.
Yeah, and we expect more of that. Even if there's no speaker in place, even if there's no permanent speaker in place, whoever is the ruling party has control over offices, has control over what they call codels, which are delegation trips to overseas and to, very important legislative missions and other facets of the purse strings. And Republican allies of the former speaker are really upset the Democrats didn't come to his rescue, and so they're exacting revenge. So we've heard of several Democratic leaders who have lost their coveted office space. We're hearing that some could be stripped of those upcoming delegation missions to different foreign nations, and some other ramifications. And, when Democrats, if they take back the House in the next election cycle, they can, do the same thing, but there won't be, it's hard to campaign on that certain issue, right? And that's why Republicans are taking that step, because beyond the Capitol and beyond a small group of voters, it just doesn't resonate. And so they feel
Right.
like they can get away with that.
Well, and Pat can ask the former speaker about that next week.
Yes.
Let's talk about the GOP drawn congressional districts post 2020. The GOP currently has a 9-5 district lead, despite largely a split toss-up in overall registration. The 6th district, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is north of Atlanta. Is that right? Was drawn to the advantage of a GOP candidate. So there are multiple lawsuits against this. Where does that stand, and how does it relate to the Supreme Court decision about Alabama's redistricting?
Yeah, everyone here in Georgia, whether you're Republican or Democratic, all the leading officials are expecting these districts to be redrawn. We'll see. We might not have a ruling anytime soon, but folks are expecting this district to be redrawn because of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling involving Alabama. And the way that the map was drawn, strongly, the U.S. Supreme Court multiple times now has strongly suggested that the lines be redrawn to have at least one more majority Black district that would favor Democrats. Well, here in Georgia, you mentioned the 6th district. That is a famous district nationally because that was the district that John Ossoff back in 2017 competed for. Is a district that Republicans had won by 21 points the year before. And after Donald Trump's victory and he appointed Tom Price, the Republican incumbent, to his cabinet, that seat became open. John Ossoff is really, to say is unknown, it might even be an understatement, right? The people who live and breathe politics in Georgia, including me, had never heard of John Ossoff. The first time I heard of him, I was coming back from a hospital visit, and I get a call from John, and he says, "Hey, I'm entering the race tomorrow." I said, "Oh, you'll be number 18." And he said, "Yeah, but I've got John Lewis endorsement, I've got a Haynes Johnson endorsement, I've got $250,000 lined up." And I said, "Okay, you're legit." But still, it was looked at as this long shot, and he lost the seat by about 4 points. Democrat Lucy McBrath ends up winning that in 2018. Republicans have a target on her, did not want her anywhere close to Congress because they know she also could be a rising national figure herself. They redraw that district to go all the way. It used to be kind of from East Cobb to North DeKalb, kind of the inner ring of Atlanta's northern suburbs, a very affluent, very well educated, frankly, very Jewish area. It's kind of the sort of Jewish backbone of the metro Atlanta community. And so that district flipped, and they drew it instead to go kind of from the edges of suburban Atlanta all the way up to the mountains of North Georgia. So they drew it so Lucy McBath could never win that seat. So she packed up her bags, went to the district next door, won that district over a Democratic incumbent. A very conservative Republican won her old district. And now the lawsuit that's pending says that, hey, look, Republican lawmakers, when they redrew that district, illegally diluted the Black voting power in Georgia, which is a violation of the Voting Rights Act if they can prove it.
So where would then the majority of Black, would it be sort of the old sixth? Is that essentially what people expect to be recreated?
That's a big question, because when Republicans redrew the district, they redrew the 6th to be very conservative. And the next door, the 7th district, which was kind of a swing district, it was based in Gwinnett County, but it had parts of the exurban Forsyth County, which is very, very Republican. And so they redrew that one to be a Democratic safe seat. So they kind of gave Democrats that seat, which Democrats already held, but they made it stronger D when they made the 6th district a very right-leaning seat. And so what could end up happening is the 7th district could become slightly more competitive. They could, the 6th district could take some of that. Believe it or not, Marjorie Taylor Greene comes in here because Republicans, as you can imagine in Georgia, aren't enamored of her either, at least the ruling Republicans. And so when they redistricted everything, they also added parts of very deep blue, majority Black Cobb County precincts into her district, much to her chagrin and their chagrin. Can you imagine, being in suburban Atlanta and suddenly being redrawn into the Marjorie Taylor Greene's district? And so there is people up in that district think that those precincts way down in Cobb County and suburban Atlanta could end up part of this newly redrawn district as well, making Marjorie's district even safer for her, if you can believe that.
What is Governor Kemp's view of Marjorie Taylor Greene? I mean, he's a fellow Republican, of course, but did he find her a thorn in his side?
Yeah, they're not allies at all. As you can imagine, with the governor becoming more of a national figure, so a lot of his views are more, at least more publicized, more known. You never call him a moderate, right? He is not you wouldn't even call him a maverick. He's very conservative. He's ushered in some of the most conservative policy agenda items in modern Georgia history, from an anti-abortion bill to transgender restrictions to a huge gun expansion. I mean, I can go on and on. But he's also not aligned with the MAGA wing of the party, even though he had Donald Trump's endorsement way back when. It's hard to remember that time, but back in 2018, he had Trump's endorsement and they were close allies. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I asked the governor about that wing of the party a few days ago at the Texas Tribune Festival in Austin. He basically said kind of what we were saying earlier. What's the plan? He goes, I know a lot of these folks want a saber rattle. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said he knows a lot of these far right Republicans want a saber rattle, but show that you can govern, right? You have the levers of power. Go make a plan. Go show the American public that you can get things done. He was just flabbergasted that the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, aren't interested in governing, but instead they're just interested in making waves and being provocative and making our jaws drop.
I read your interview with the governor it was just a few weeks ago that you interviewed him, and I read that was interesting, and because now there's no love lost, of course, between the former president and the governor, but Governor Kemp said that he would still vote for Trump if he is the nominee over Joe Biden, and he said Biden's policies have been bad for Georgia. But I was thinking, Georgia's economy is booming, right? So is he just referring to inflation as that comment? Or because it seems that things are pretty good in your state.
And there's the rub, right? I mean, we have seen some high-ranking Republican officials say that no matter what, they won't back Donald Trump, but it's still looked at as a betrayal. And for someone like Brian Kemp, who, 4 years ago, we never think of Brian Kemp as a potential White House candidate. And now, frankly, especially here in Georgia, but I think nationally, there's a lot of folks who think that he could very well run in 2028. And before that, he could very well challenge Jon Ossoff in 2026. And you know what he needs? He needs the Republican base here in Georgia to support him. 57% of the likely GOP voters in Georgia say that they'll back Donald Trump. And even if that number is way overblown, you still have 20% or so of hardcore Donald Trump supporters, no matter what. When it comes to the economy, you're right. Georgia has record low jobless rates. I asked him about this. That was my follow-up. Georgia has record low jobless rates, hundreds of thousands of new jobs, billions and billions of investment. And most of it is fueled, or at least a big part of it is fueled by electric vehicle incentives and green energy incentives that Democrats and Joe Biden backed. His argument, and one that he made literally at the grand opening of an electric vehicle, electric battery component factory down in South Georgia was that it wasn't those incentives, that it was Georgia's pro-business policies that helped bring those companies, the state's highly trained workforce, its logistics networks, the incentives that the state offers. And when I push him on that, he says basically, look, every state has the same federal incentives, right? Every state government can dangle those same federal incentives. So why are they coming to Georgia? They're coming to Georgia for a reason, that we are
Business friendliness. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you wrote a whole book on this, so it's hard to condense it into a short period, but what are the reasons behind the flip that we've seen in Georgia? Is part of this the Trump effect, that suburban voters are turned off by Trump? How much of it is demographic shifts that have taken place in Georgia, even immigration that's affected the service sector? You know, how much of each of these have been contributors to the move to make it a purple state?
Yeah, there's a few factors. One is that Democrats aren't afraid to be Democrats anymore in Georgia. Now, not so long ago, you had Democratic statewide candidates who were running for very high offices who turned around and ran away when President Obama came to town. When other high-ranking Democratic Washington officials came to town, they'd be anywhere but the tarmac to greet Obama. You know, one of them said that they had to find a peach farm in South Georgia to be at instead of greeting the then president. But it goes beyond just that. It goes beyond on issues, right? I mean, not so long ago, it was the norm for Democrats in Georgia to run as NRA Democrats, to support gun expansions, or at least not to speak out against them. Same thing with abortion, LGBTQ issues, a number of other issues that sort of define the party's policies today. In Georgia, you had a lot of Democrats running, in their own words, as kind of Republican lights who would focus on education funding and important issues, but not some of the policy issues that we see as the dividing lines today. That started to change with Stacey Abrams when she started speaking openly about opposing, about supporting gun safety rules. Like, it doesn't seem like that would be a big deal today, but in Georgia, that was an enormous change in policy. I think the other big thing is the suburbs, right? It's partly because of Donald Trump, partly because of the changing nature of Metro Atlanta suburbs. Where I live, north DeKalb County, Cobb County, where my wife is from, the home of former Speaker Newt Gingrich, the home of Johnny Isaacson. These were not areas that anyone ever thought would flip blue. But in 2016, Cobb County and North DeKalb County and Gwinnett County, another huge suburb of Atlanta, they all went blue for the first time since Jimmy Carter was president. And it still wasn't enough for Hillary Clinton to take Georgia, but it started that shift. And the blue counties just got bluer, and the red counties just got redder. Counties that Mitt Romney won with 70% of the vote, Donald Trump won with 90% of the vote. So we have more polarization. But I think the fact that the suburbs were suddenly in play have dramatically transformed Georgia politics. And when you look at what happened in 2021 with Senators Warnock and Ossoff, their runoff victories, and then in 2022 with Warnock's re-election victory after that special election he won in 2021, they looked at the Atlanta suburbs as the cornerstone of their electoral coalition. You know, they could not have won without the soaring returns they got in Gwinnett County and in Cobb County. And those will continue to be the battlegrounds, because guess what? That's where a huge number of those independent leaning or moderate or former Republican voters who cannot stomach anyone associated with Donald Trump or Donald Trump himself, that's where they live.
Well, it'll be interesting to see post-Trump, whenever that era occurs, what happens with those suburban voters. Did Stacey Abrams' national profile, the fact she became a bigger figure than just in Georgia, also aid Democrats politically, having a star like her?
It helped them and it hurt them. I remember being with the governor in 2019 we were in a helicopter going to a tornado-stricken area, and he joked about Stacey Abrams, that she's become more famous than he has in her defeat, right? And it's true. You know, she gave the rebuttal to the State of the Union that Donald Trump gave that year. She was courted by Chuck Schumer to run for U.S. Senate. She was all over the airway. I went to San Antonio, Texas for one of her just appearances. It wasn't even to sell a book. It was just one of her appearances. And the place was packed to the gills, Nashville, you name it, right? She would sell out crowds everywhere. But that, of course, becomes a liability to some on the campaign trail. What did Republicans do? They said she was Stacey the celebrity, right? That she was hobnobbing. She was going to overseas conferences and she was going everywhere but Georgia. She wasn't listening to the needs of regular Georgia voters. And also when you factor that into also the fact that, for the better part of the last decade, every Republican running for office in Georgia, dog catcher in rural Georgia, they were running against Stacey Abrams, right? They were making vote for me and I'll fight Stacey Abrams policies as the county coroner. I mean, literally.
So it's the flip side of becoming iconic then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That her record and her unfavorabilities were so high that it takes a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of messaging to kind of bring those unfavorables, which were extremely high, down to a level where she was winnable.
Let me go back to some listener questions. Jonathan asks, is there open conflict between Trump and Trump Republicans, I should say, and Governor Kemp? And how does Kemp survive Trump's enmity?
Yeah, that's a great question, because look, right after there was definitely open conflict. I mean, we saw it throughout the last year when Donald Trump recruited former Senator David Perdue to run against the governor. When the governor did everything he could, used every kind of lever of power at his disposal to wall off any chance that David Perdue won, ended up beating David Perdue by 52 points. But then something remarkable happened. Right after that primary victory, the AJC did a poll that showed 93% of Republicans backed Brian Kemp. Part of it's the Stacey Abrams factor, because as I mentioned, she had been so vilified that even MAGA supporters who might have hated Brian Kemp were still willing to vote for him. But part of it is also his messaging, right? He wouldn't shy away from talking about abortion or gun rights or the other issues that would turn off moderate voters. But his go-to was public safety, and his go-to was inflation, was vote for me and I'll do what I can to shield Georgians from inflation and Joe Biden's disastrous policies, in his words. That conflict has not gone away. The Georgia GOP is populated by hard right Trump MAGA. And when I say Georgia GOP, I mean the actual state party. Mm-hmm. And they're right now fundraising to pay legal bills for 3 fake electors who were indicted by Fani Willis just a few weeks ago. Brian Kemp doesn't want anything to do with that, right? He doesn't want to have anything to do with the state party that openly went against him and that is still so allied with Donald Trump. So to the point where they had a state convention a few months ago that Donald Trump showed up at, and Brian Kemp boycotted. He started his own organization. So there's still that rift. But the question is, does it show up in the vote? Will it matter in 2024? And we saw in 2022, the runoff, it did matter. Statewide Republican figures like Brian Kemp and everyone else on the statewide ballot won, except for Herschel Walker, except for the one candidate most closely aligned with Donald Trump.
I just want to mention, Greg just mentioned the AJC and the poll they did. That's the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the paper for which he reports.
Yeah, not the American Jewish Committee.
Yeah, right. Just want to, Janice actually caught that, which is very glad for that. So let's talk about the prosecution of the former president and others. 13 charges against the president, charges against 18 of his allies. October 23rd, the start of the cases against 2 of the lawyers of the former president. They wanted expedited trials, Sidney Powell, Kenneth Chesborough. And how much of the prosecution of the first 2 is really going to reveal and lay out what likely awaits the former president and the others?
Yeah, everyone down here feels like it will be a preview of Fani Willis's case against Donald Trump. We'll see at least a glimpse of it. And what was so important last week, when one of the 19 defendants in this case, Scott Hall, who's a bail bondsman, when he flipped, when he took a deal in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors. Well, he's most known, and one of the charges against him is associated with his role down in rural Georgia of breaching sensitive election voter data in Coffee County, Georgia. But he's also, according to the indictment, he's also involved in declaring himself an agent of the Donald Trump campaign, involved in the pressure campaign against officials in Georgia and beyond. And that's where it could really come into play. That's where, if you're an attorney for Sidney Powell, Kenneth Chesborough, you're really worried about what what Hall could say about you, what Scott Hall could say about you in that upcoming trial, because he could be a very, very valuable witness, not just in the other case the other defendants I talked about, but in this speedy trial.
How are the defendants raising money to pay? I mean, these are going to be long trials, very costly for them to defend themselves. Do you have any information about how they're doing that?
Yeah, and that is why Fani Willis is aggressively, and we reported in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution just yesterday that many, or at least a handful of these defendants have gotten overtures or direct offers from Fani Willis to flip into because look, these are racketeering charges, enormously costly litigation. They could drag on, it already has dragged on for more than a month, but could drag on for months upon months. So it's going to be a significant legal bill. We've seen some of these defendants go online and basically plead for money, crowdfund, send out links to donate to their legal defense. We've seen some say publicly, or at least through their families, that they cannot afford the mounting legal fees, which is in some ways either a preview that they will flip, or at least a plea for help from Trump's allies, like, hey, you better shore this up. And a lot of people criticize Fani Willis for such a sprawling indictment, but this is why she did it, right? This is sort of her track record. She was also the lead prosecutor of the Atlanta Public School cheating scandal about a decade ago. She indicted dozens of people. Only a handful, only about a dozen ended up going to trial. The rest either took deals or dropped out. This is a strategy here right now. We know Donald Trump is using his campaign funds, that he has no problem raising the money, or at least he doesn't have as much of a problem. But we're looking very close to the others. And one more point on that, the 3 fake electors who were all members of the Georgia GOP, kind of high-ranking Georgia GOP officials, well, the state party is paying their legal defense, or at least the bulk of it. And we reported earlier today that the state party has already spent more than $1 million on legal
those
defense,
3.
most of it going to those 3. It's a huge amount of money for. Imagine you're a grassroots Republican in Liberty County, Georgia, and you want to help your local Republican elected officials win by giving money to the state party, and instead it's going for legal defense for 3 fake electors. Well, that's what's happening.
Fred says, Trump's folks got into voting machines in a rural Georgia county. Was the software of the machines compromised?
So there's still a question about how much of the sensitive data that they got, but the votes themselves, the Dominion, the actual votes that we understand are not compromised. It's some of the sensitive voting data around that. The software was, the hardware was infiltrated, and they were able to scan it all. And actually, Hall, the defendant who flipped, was said in the indictment, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, we got it, we got all the data. So it's still unclear exactly how much data they got. And frankly, just something to remember about this, Coffee County, Georgia is not some swing county. This is not a competitive county. This is an overwhelmingly Republican county, but that is what happened all over Georgia, and I'm sure in other battleground states too, where Trump's allies would target these Republican counties and say, hey, we won this county by 70, but it should have been 80. This is election fraud. And they had a willing audience. Coffee County was not the only place where I heard from local election officials back in 2020 and early 2021, where there were attempts to persuade election officials to take steps to undermine Joe Biden's victory.
Greg, Stacey Abrams said after her loss of the governor's office that there was voter suppression, which kept her from winning. And Samuel, our viewer, asks, is voter suppression an issue in Georgia? And I just follow up, was she able to identify areas clearly where people were intimidated or discouraged from voting who otherwise would have?
Well, I went with Stacey Abrams when she cast her ballot in 2018 at a mall in South DeKalb County, which is a very is a big Democratic stronghold. And there was this weird delay. I was with some other reporters, and we were kind of waiting outside, and it took a little longer than we expected. And what had happened was I think she had initially signed up for an absentee ballot, and she ended up voting early in person. And the records that the county had indicated that she had already taken an absentee ballot. So she had to spend time and clear it up. And I think she was frankly embarrassed, because that could be a weird moment for the campaign. She let us know later on what exactly happened. But her point then was, hey, I am a voting rights advocate. I am a Ivy League trained lawyer. I know this stuff in and out, and it took me time to explain to elections officials why I should cast my ballot. Imagine your average voter. And so, no, it's hard to pinpoint. There's a few cases, of people, a handful of cases that we investigated back in 2018, where we could say, this or that person's right to a ballot was infringed upon. They can still cast provisional ballots. There's still other remedies. But her point was that the overall sort of atmosphere had turned away, that had discouraged voting. It made voting harder for people. Whether it be
there was a record turnout, though, wasn't there?
Record turnout, right? For sure. Record turnout, huge number of turnout in 2020, in 2022. And that's what makes the case so hard for Democrats right now, because you had soaring turnout, but at the same time, you also had this new law, SB 202, that got a lot of national attention. They required voter ID. It limited the use of ballot drop boxes. It limited it limited voting hours in some communities. And to me, the biggest part of it is it gave the Georgia legislature, which is solidly controlled by Republicans, more oversight of elections in emergency situations. And so again, it's hard to kind of pinpoint this person wasn't allowed to vote, but it's the overall atmosphere the Democrats are concerned about.
This has gone so fast, Greg. We need to wrap with a final comment from you. But if you don't mind, I'd like to use a listener question as the prompt for your close, if you don't mind. And Mike asks, was 2020 an anomaly, or can Democrats win Georgia again?
Well, that's a great prompt, because that was kind of going to be my closing anyway. Look,
right.
2020, 2021, 2022, Democrats scored statewide victories in Georgia. Joe Biden won the state for the first time. He became the first Democrat to win the state since Bill Clinton, 1992. John Ossoff, Raphael Warnock followed it up in 2021 with their runoff victories that flipped control of the U.S. Senate. And then, of course, Raphael Warnock beat back Herschel Walker in a statewide runoff. It feels like it is less than a year ago. The same court of dynamics governed all those races. Democrats alone cannot win in Georgia, but there is a small but really important, really consequential block of independent-leaning, moderate, former Republican voters, however you want to define them, that are swing votes that we saw in 2022, voted for Brian Kemp, but also voted for Raphael Warnock. That block isn't going away. In fact, I think it's just solidifying. Again, it's not huge. We're not talking 10% of the electorate, but we're talking 2 or 3% electorate in Georgia, which is enough to swing an election. And in Georgia, you've heard it from Republicans, you've heard it from Democrats. Republicans cannot win the White House without winning Georgia. Chris Christie came down here just the other day and said that to me, to my face. Georgia is indispensable to Republicans. Democrats have other ways to still win the White House if they lose Georgia. Republicans, their path is invisible if they don't win Georgia. And as I look at 2024, and I look at that block of voters, many of them here in the suburbs, I don't have any evidence that they're suddenly going back to the Republican Party, especially with Donald Trump on the ballot. And that's what keeps Republicans like Brian Kemp up at night. And that's what is energizing Democrats right now.
Greg, this has been terrific. Thank you very much. Fascinating look in detail at Georgia politics. Thanks as well for your willingness to take on what happened on Capitol Hill yesterday and what we'll be seeing in the days to come. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here again.
It's been a pleasure. Well, thank you for joining us this evening for another America to Crossroads. I ask you, please, if you're not yet a supporter of either of the two organizations that put on these programs that are, of course, free for your viewing, please support them at your first opportunity. The organizations are Jews United for Democracy and Justice. That's Jews United for Democracy and Justice, or Community Advocates, Inc. Community Advocates, Inc. You can support either one of those with your tax-deductible contribution. It goes right in to supporting the program. Staff is not paid. This is done for the support of the communities across the country to bring you these great conversations. And next Wednesday, a very special one, former House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi next Wednesday, 5 o'clock Pacific, in conversation with Pulitzer Prize winner and terrific columnist for the Los Angeles Times, my friend Pat Morrison. You won't want to miss this, particularly with the wild days that we've had on Capitol Hill. It'll be a great night to discuss with House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi the events of Washington, D.C. That's next Wednesday, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.